Snoop wasn't in a rush. He had just finished up a meeting, nothing major, just a casual sit-down with some folks, and now he was standing outside, scrolling through his phone, waiting for his ride. The air was cool, the city lights reflected off the pavement, and it was one of those nights where everything just felt easy. Then the taxi pulled up. Snoop stepped forward, reaching for the door handle, but before he could even touch it, the driver locked the doors. For a second, Snoop just stood there, his hand hovering in the air, blinking at his own reflection in the car window. Did that just happen? The driver, a man in his late 40s, leaned toward the passenger side, shaking his head. His expression was tight, controlled, like he had already made up his mind about something. "Nah, man. I can't take you." Snoop tilted his head slightly, taking a slow step back. "You can't take me?" The driver exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Yeah. I'm just not doing this ride." Snoop didn't get mad. He didn't argue. He just stood there, watching the guy, letting the silence stretch. Because now he was curious. Snoop had called for a ride like he had done 1,000 times before. It wasn't anything special, just another evening, just another city, just another cab pulling up to the curb. He had just finished a casual meeting, nothing big, just business as usual. Now, he was ready to head back, maybe grab something to eat on the way, and unwind. The street was quiet, the air had that late-night chill to it, and the glow of the streetlights reflected off the pavement, making the whole city feel slower than it actually was. He wasn't thinking about much, just scrolling through his phone, checking messages, waiting for his ride. Then the taxi pulled up. Snoop stepped forward, one hand still holding his phone, the other reaching for the door handle. And then, click. The doors locked. Snoop stopped mid-step, his fingers hovering over the handle, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. For a second, he thought maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was some automatic security thing. Maybe the guy just needed a second to reset something. Then he looked through the window. The driver, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a tired expression, was shaking his head. His knuckles were tight around the wheel, and his face had this look, not anger, not fear, just decision. "Nah, man. I can't take you." Snoop had opened 1,000 car doors in his life without thinking about it. It was muscle memory, step forward, pull the handle, slide in. Simple. But this time, his hand hovered over the door handle for just a second longer than usual, because that little click had changed everything. It was subtle, quiet, the kind of sound most people wouldn't even register, but Snoop knew what it meant. The doors had just been locked. Not an accident, not a malfunction, a decision. He didn't move back. Didn't step away. Just stayed where he was, his fingertips inches from the handle, his reflection staring back at him in the window. The air around him didn't change, the city still hummed, headlights still flickered across the pavement, but suddenly, the ride that was supposed to be a routine trip wasn't routine anymore. Inside the car, the driver sat stiffly, his hands gripping the wheel just a little too tight. His fingers tapped against the plastic, a slow, rhythmic motion, like he was trying to decide whether or not to say something. Then he did. "Nah, man. I can't take you." Snoop wasn't the type to react immediately. That was how you let people control a situation, by letting them rush you into a response. Instead, he stood there for a second, letting the silence stretch, letting the driver hear his own words settle in the air. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to signal he had heard him, just enough to show he was still present. "You can't take me?" The driver exhaled, his grip on the wheel tightening for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. "Yeah. I'm just not doing this ride." Snoop studied him for a moment, taking in the little details, the way his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror like he was checking to see if anyone else was watching, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel like he was trying to keep his hands busy, the way he wasn't looking directly at Snoop, but just past him, like focusing on something else would make the conversation end faster. Snoop wasn't mad. He wasn't even annoyed. He was just curious. The city hadn't changed. Cars were still rolling by. People were still walking down the sidewalk a block away. Neon lights still flickered in the distance. But standing there, just inches from a locked door, it felt like the noise had dimmed. Snoop wasn't saying anything, and neither was the driver. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy. Because now, it wasn't about the ride anymore. It was about what wasn't being said. Snoop had met a lot of people in his life. He had learned early on that words weren't always the best indicator of what someone was thinking. Body language always told the truth. And this guy? He was trying to act neutral, trying to keep his expression controlled, but it wasn't working. His mouth was set in a tight line, his jaw clenched slightly, his shoulders held a little too high like he was bracing for something that wasn't coming. He had already made up his mind before Snoop had even reached for the door. And now he was just waiting to see what would happen next. Most people would have said something by now. They would have demanded an explanation, argued, raised their voice, made a scene. That was what the driver probably expected. But Snoop just stood there. That was the part that made the driver uncomfortable. Not anger. Not frustration. Just patience. Because when you didn't react the way someone expected, it forced them to sit in their own decisions. And right now, this guy was realizing, in real time, that he was the only one making this weird. The guy shifted slightly in his seat, adjusted his mirror, cleared his throat. Snoop had seen this before. The slow unraveling of someone realizing they were overcommit to a choice they didn't need to make. The quiet battle between I already made this decision and I'm starting to feel dumb about it. If he had just driven off, maybe it would have felt different. Maybe he could have told himself he had somewhere to be, that it wasn't personal, that it was just another night on the job. But he was still here. Still sitting in his car. Still parked in front of Snoop Dogg, who wasn't reacting the way he expected. Snoop pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen, and booked another ride. One tap, a few seconds, done. He wasn't stranded. He wasn't stuck. He had options. But he also wasn't in a hurry to leave. So he just stood there, still not saying anything, still waiting. The driver glanced at the phone in Snoop's hand, his eyes flicking toward the notification on the screen, the confirmation of another car on the way. And that was when he realized he had lost control of the moment. If the guy had just driven off immediately, maybe it would have felt different. Maybe he could have walked away from this feeling justified. But now, sitting there, watching Snoop calmly waiting for his new ride, he had to sit in his own decision. And it wasn't sitting right. Snoop could see it in his face. The shift in his expression. The way his fingers tapped faster against the steering wheel like he was trying to distract himself. He had thought he was making a point. But now he was realizing he had just made it weird for himself. Snoop's phone buzzed. His new ride was down the street. He nodded slightly to himself, finally taking a step back from the locked car. "Aight, man. You be safe out here." The driver flinched, just a little. Like he wasn't expecting that. Like he was waiting for something else. But that was all Snoop said. He turned, walked a few feet, and stepped into his new ride, closing the door behind him. And just like that, it was over. As Snoop's new ride pulled off, he glanced out the window, watching as the first driver finally put his car in gear and drove off in the opposite direction. Too late to make it feel normal. Too late to undo it. Snoop wasn't mad. Wasn't frustrated. Wasn't even thinking about it anymore. But the driver? He'd probably think about it later. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. But at some point, maybe when he was sitting alone, maybe when another passenger got in his car and he felt something familiar, he'd remember. And maybe then, maybe he'd realize he had been the only one making it weird. Snoop leaned slightly on his back foot, shifting his weight as he kept his eyes on the driver. The guy hadn't moved an inch. His hand still rested on the steering wheel, fingers drumming lightly against the leather, like he was waiting for something, maybe waiting for Snoop to walk away, maybe waiting for this moment to dissolve into nothing. But the problem was, Snoop wasn't in a hurry. The street around them was the same as it had been minutes ago. Cars passed by, headlights flickering against the pavement, and the occasional honk echoed somewhere in the distance. But for them, it felt like the whole city had paused. The driver wasn't leaving, but he wasn't saying anything either. And Snoop? Snoop was just watching. Not angrily. Not impatiently. Just waiting. And the longer he waited, the more uncomfortable the driver seemed to get. The driver had already made his choice. That was the thing about moments like this. Once you locked in, once you made a decision like refusing to take a rider, there was no reversing it without looking stupid. If he had driven off right away, maybe he could have convinced himself that he had somewhere else to be, that it wasn't personal, that he had a valid reason. But he hadn't driven off. He was still here, still sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead like if he didn't acknowledge Snoop's presence, the whole thing might disappear. But it wasn't disappearing. It was stretching. It was becoming something he had to deal with instead of something he could avoid. Snoop wasn't making it weird. The driver was doing that all by himself. Silence wasn't always awkward. Some people knew how to use it, how to turn it into something that worked in their favor. But in this situation, the silence was only making things worse. Snoop wasn't playing along. He wasn't getting mad, wasn't arguing, wasn't asking why. He was just standing there, arms loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. That was what was throwing the driver off. He had expected a reaction, and he wasn't getting one. And when people don't get the reaction they expect, they start second-guessing themselves. The driver shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture like that would somehow make the moment feel less weird. His fingers tapped a little faster against the wheel. He cleared his throat. He was waiting for something to happen. But nothing was happening. And that was worse than anything else. Snoop had been in situations like this before. Not with taxi drivers, necessarily, but with people who had locked themselves into a stance and didn't know how to back out of it. People who had convinced themselves they were making the right move until they realized they weren't. That was what was happening right now. Snoop wasn't doing anything, but the power in the situation was shifting toward him. He wasn't trying to control the moment, but he didn't have to. Because the guy was realizing, second by second, that he had made this moment bigger than it needed to be. And now, he had no idea how to get out of it. Another car pulled up behind them, its headlights reflecting off the back window of the taxi. The driver glanced in his mirror, adjusting his posture again, but he still didn't move. Snoop exhaled through his nose, barely shaking his head. What now? The driver flinched just slightly. Because that was the question, wasn't it? What now? He had made his point, hadn't he? He had refused the ride, hadn't he? But now, instead of driving off, he was still here, stuck in the moment he had created for himself. The driver looked at his phone screen for a second, like he was pretending to check something, like maybe he had a notification, maybe he had a reason to suddenly leave. But he didn't move. Snoop let the moment sit, let the guy sit in his own decision. He wasn't going to step back, wasn't going to argue, wasn't going to do anything that would make the driver feel like he had won something. Because what was there to win? This wasn't a fight. This wasn't even a conversation. It was just a guy realizing he had created an awkward situation for himself, and now he was stuck in it. Snoop pulled his phone out, checked his ride status, and booked a new car with one tap. No hesitation. No frustration. Just moving on. The driver's eyes flicked to the screen. And that was when he realized how small this had actually been. Snoop wasn't stranded. He wasn't mad. He was just booking another ride like nothing happened. And somehow, that made the whole thing feel even dumber. A few minutes later, Snoop's new ride pulled up at the curb. He didn't rush toward it. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just stepped back from the locked taxi and gave the driver a slow nod. "Aight, man. You be safe out here." The driver flinched again. He had been expecting something else, anger, sarcasm, anything. But Snoop had nothing to prove. And now? Now the driver had to sit with it. Snoop slid into his new ride, closed the door, and let the city move past him. Behind him, the taxi finally pulled away, but too late to pretend like this had never happened. Too late to undo the moment. Too late to make it feel normal again. And that was on him. Snoop leaned back against the seat, watching the streetlights blur through the window. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Wouldn't be the last either. But the difference? Snoop wasn't the one thinking about it anymore. The driver, though? Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday, sitting in his car, waiting for another ride request, he'd remember. And maybe then, he'd realize he had been the only one making it weird. As the driver pulled away from the curb, he expected to feel relieved. The whole situation was over, Snoop was gone, he didn't have to explain himself, and he could move on like it never happened. But as he drove through the city streets, weaving between traffic, something felt off. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, his fingers pressing a little harder than necessary. He wasn't tense. He wasn't nervous. But he wasn't comfortable either. Normally, after a decision like this, he would have let it go. He had every right to refuse a ride if he wanted to, didn't he? So why did it feel like he had just put himself in a situation he didn't know how to get out of? At the next stoplight, the driver exhaled slowly and adjusted the rearview mirror, even though there was nothing behind him but empty road. He glanced at the ride request screen out of habit, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking for another passenger. He was replaying the moment. Not the words, those had been simple enough. Not the refusal, he had done that before. It was the way Snoop had looked at him. No anger. No frustration. Just patience. Like he had already known how this would go. Like he had already seen this happen before. And the longer the driver sat there, waiting for the light to change, the more he realized something. He had been waiting for a reaction. And he never got one. A ride request came through. He accepted it. It was muscle memory at this point, pick up, drop off, move on. That was the rhythm. The passenger slid into the back seat without a word, headphones in, eyes on their phone. No conversation. No questions. Just another person looking to get from one place to another. And yet, for the first time all night, the driver found himself thinking about the person he didn't pick up. He kept driving, turning onto a quieter street, watching the traffic move around him, but his mind wasn't where it should have been. He had taken thousands of rides in this city, had gone through thousands of forgettable interactions. So why was this one different? The streets blurred past the windows, neon signs flashing across the windshield as he navigated familiar roads. But his focus wasn't on where he was going, it was on where he had been just minutes ago. Because now, he wasn't thinking about why he had refused Snoop's ride. He was thinking about why he was still thinking about it. Something about it didn't sit right. Not because he expected consequences. Not because anything bad had happened. But because he realized he had been the only one who made the situation weird. The driver pulled into a parking lot to take a break, turning off the engine. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the glow of his dashboard, but his thoughts were still circling the same moment. If Snoop had argued, if he had made a scene, if he had tried to fight the decision, maybe the driver could have convinced himself he was right. Maybe he could have justified it, pushed the blame onto someone else, told himself it was just another bad passenger he didn't want to deal with. But that wasn't what happened. Snoop had just nodded. And then he booked another ride. Like it wasn't even worth a second thought. Except now, the driver couldn't stop giving it one. Usually, after a long shift, the city felt smaller. It was familiar, predictable, something he had learned to navigate with his eyes half closed. But tonight, it felt like it had stretched. Like the streets were longer than before. Like the ride home was going to take more time than it should. Because no matter how many miles he put between himself and that curb, his mind kept circling back to the same place. And the farther he drove, the clearer it became. This wasn't about Snoop. This was about him. If someone asked him why he was thinking about it, he wouldn't know how to answer. It wasn't like anything had gone wrong. It wasn't like there had been a fight, or a bad review, or some kind of public embarrassment. So why was this moment still sitting in the back of his mind? Why did it feel like something had shifted? Why did it feel like he had just made the wrong kind of memory? Another request came through. The driver sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before accepting it. The passenger got in, a woman with shopping bags, chatting on her phone about something unimportant. The car filled with the sound of her conversation, but the driver wasn't listening. He was too busy realizing how much he wished he could rewind time 5 minutes and redo the whole thing. Not because he wanted to change the outcome, but because he wanted to change the way he felt about it. At the end of his shift, the driver pulled into his usual spot, turned off the car, and just sat there for a while. The city was quiet now, the roads empty, nothing left to distract him. This should have been just another night. But it wasn't. Because now, he had to live with the way it ended. And that was the part that didn't sit right. Snoop wasn't thinking about this. That much, the driver knew for sure. He was out there somewhere, moving on, already past it. This wasn't a moment for him. It wasn't even an inconvenience. It was just something that had happened, something he had barely acknowledged. But for the driver? For the driver, this was going to sit with him. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday, he'd be sitting in his car, waiting for another rider, and this would come back to him. And maybe then, he'd finally understand why. The city was still awake, but inside the driver's car, it felt like everything had slowed down. The hum of the engine was low, steady, and predictable, but his thoughts weren't. The moment should have been over, he had left, Snoop had left, and nothing had actually happened. And yet, as he drove down the familiar streets, past the same neon-lit signs, past the same blocks he had driven through hundreds of times before, something about the night felt different. Usually, he felt at home in the driver's seat. It was his space, his routine, the place where he was in control. But now, for the first time in a long time, it felt like he was just a passenger in his own car. And the thought of that? That was the part that didn't sit right. Most choices in life came and went without a second thought. He had spent years behind the wheel, making snap decisions, taking routes without thinking, picking up and dropping off strangers like it was nothing. But tonight, he kept circling back to the same question. Why did I refuse? It had felt justified in the moment. Hadn't it? He had told himself it was just a gut feeling, just something that didn't sit right. But now, looking back, he couldn't explain it. He had turned someone away for no reason he could actually put into words. And if you couldn't explain a decision, if you couldn't even tell yourself why you made it, did you really make the right one? It wasn't like he had done anything to Snoop. He hadn't yelled at him, hadn't insulted him, hadn't started a fight. If anything, the interaction had been as brief as possible, a few words, a locked door, and that was it. But that was the problem. Because it wasn't about what happened. It was about what didn't happen. Snoop hadn't given him a hard time, hadn't questioned him, hadn't tried to change his mind. He had just stood there, let the moment be what it was, and then moved on. And somehow, that was what made it worse. Snoop had moved on. That much was obvious. The guy had tapped his phone, booked another ride, and gone about his night like it wasn't even a bump in the road. He hadn't let the moment linger. He hadn't let it change his energy. But the driver? He wasn't moving on. He was sitting in it, dragging it with him, carrying it in the back of his mind no matter how far he drove. And that was the difference. Some people knew how to let things go. And some people didn't realize they were holding onto something until it was too late. He pulled up to a red light, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, staring at the glowing numbers of the time display on his dashboard. He should have been taking another ride by now. The app was still open, waiting, another fare just a tap away. But he wasn't reaching for it. He wasn't even looking at it. Because right now, he wasn't thinking about where he was going, he was stuck thinking about where he had been. And the light turned green, but for the first time all night, he didn't feel like moving forward. Regret didn't always hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't always dramatic, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in quietly. Sometimes it wasn't about a big mistake. Sometimes it was just about realizing that you could have handled something differently, and now you'll never get the chance. This wasn't regret in the traditional sense. He hadn't done anything wrong. But there was something about the moment that wouldn't let go of him. Maybe it was because it had been too easy. Maybe it was because he had expected more from the interaction, an argument, a confrontation, something to make him feel like he had made the right choice. But he hadn't gotten any of that. And now, he was left with nothing but himself. He had spent years driving these streets, knew them better than most. Could get from one side of the city to the other without a GPS, knew every shortcut, every alley, every hidden turn that shaved minutes off a trip. But tonight, every street felt the same. Because no matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles passed under his tires, his thoughts weren't going anywhere. And the thing about being alone in a car, with nothing but your own mind, you can't outrun a thought. He picked up one last ride. A woman in her 30s, carrying a shopping bag, her face half lit by the glow of her phone screen as she scrolled through messages. She barely looked up as she slid into the back seat. For a second, the driver wondered if she could tell. Tell that his head wasn't in it. Tell that he wasn't present the way he normally was. Tell that tonight, something was sitting on his shoulders that hadn't been there before. She almost asked how his night was going. He could feel the words forming, could see the way her lips parted slightly before she changed her mind and went back to her phone. And in that moment, he was grateful. Because he wasn't sure he could answer her. At the end of his shift, he pulled into his usual parking spot and turned off the engine. He sat there for a while, listening to the low hum of the city outside his window. This should have been the easiest part of the night, the part where he let everything go, where he left the job in the rearview mirror and went inside without a second thought. But he didn't move. Because something about this night didn't feel like all the others. And he wasn't sure why. Snoop had already forgotten about it. That much, the driver knew. He wasn't the type to hold on to something that small. He had other things to do, other people to see, a life that didn't revolve around one moment in a random parking lot. But the driver? The driver was still in his car, staring at the darkened windshield, thinking about the ride he never took. And at some point, maybe not tonight, maybe not even soon, but someday, when he found himself in the same situation, when he pulled up to another curb, another rider waiting, another moment where he had to make a choice. Maybe then? Maybe he'd get it right. The driver sat in his parked car, staring at nothing. He had finished his shift. He had turned off the engine. He had done everything he was supposed to do. But for some reason, he still wasn't moving. It wasn't about Snoop. It wasn't even about the ride he had refused. It was about the way it stayed, the way it sat in his chest, the way it replayed in his mind without his permission. Most moments faded. This one didn't. He tried to shake it off. Tried to convince himself it didn't matter. But it did. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No argument. No frustration. Just a moment that should have ended but didn't. He had refused a ride, but now he was the one who couldn't move on. Snoop wasn't thinking about it. That was the part that stung the most. The moment was already gone for him. But for the driver, it had become something else. Something he wouldn't forget. Something that would sit with him the next time he pulled up to a curb, when another passenger opened the door, when he had to make a decision he couldn't take back. And maybe next time, maybe he'd get it right.